My name is David Phillips, and I direct the program on peace building and rights. And we're one of the sponsors of tonight's program, along with the Harriman Institute and the European Institute. Victoria Phillips and I share a surname. We share a good friend in Helena Finn, and we share sponsorship of the program tonight. But at least for now, that's where our common ground ends. We'll have to explore other areas of cooperation in the future, but no better place to start than with Helena Finn, who is a very dear friend and a colleague, somebody who I've known for many years. I remember going to the U.S. ambassador's residence in Ankara, and there was a huge bouquet of flowers right in the middle of the reception room. And I looked through this bouquet, and on the other side of the daylilies was Helena Finn.
That's lovely, David.
You don't remember those lilies? Well, I do, because my life really changed profoundly when I met Helena. We became close collaborators, good friends. I chaired something called the Turkish-Armenian Reconciliation Commission, and it was largely as a result of Helena's inspiration and support that we were able to organize that and get it launched. And through that work, I was exposed to Armenian issues, Chaldean Assyrian issues. I'm deeply involved now in Syria. So I found that Helena is a kindred spirit with whom I share values and professional interests. And when we had the opportunity to invite her to become a fellow at our Peace Building and Rights program, we couldn't miss the chance. Some people come as visiting scholars, and they don't really do anything. They just have a fancy title. Not so with Helena Finn. She's produced an important piece of work, which she'll be discussing this evening. And through her efforts in the U.S. government, there's now a much more open-minded and entrepreneurial approach to diplomacy. And having played a small role in encouraging that, I'm so glad that Helena is with us here at Columbia, and so glad to welcome you here at this evening's program, and grateful to you, Victoria, for organizing everything. Thank you, and have a great evening.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, David. David Phillips. And thank you for your co-sponsorship, which gave us the good housekeeping stamp of approval to keep going. So I deeply appreciate it. Thank you to the Harriman Institute and, of course, the European Institute. This lecture series, and Helena, Dr. Finn is the last of 3 for this semester, is a part of a cultural initiative within the European Institute. And we are always grateful to Helena. This institute really opened about 6 years ago, 5-6 years ago. And Dr. Finn was at the very first student conference. It was a joint West Point Military Academy, Columbia University conference on radio as diplomacy. And we've been graced with Dr. Finn's presence every year since. So it's been a wonderful exploration, and we have built a practice of teaching cultural diplomacy and the history of cultural diplomacy. I have been truly blessed because as someone studying dance and the history of dance, I was very much accepted as an academic as well by Dr. Finn, who understood the importance of dance as cultural diplomacy and as something that could create international understanding and change. So I thank you. And I thank all of those in the audience who also are practitioners of diplomacy, both in the public and the private sector, and those who are studying. Dr. Helena Kane Finn is a visiting scholar affiliated with the Institute for the Study of Human Rights at Columbia University. A career diplomat of the Department of State, she served as Minister Counselor for Public Affairs at the U.S. Embassy in Berlin and as Counselor for Public Affairs at the U.S. Embassy in Tel Aviv. She has been the Cyrus Vance Fellow in Diplomatic Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations in New York. Her seminal article on public diplomacy appeared in the November-December issue of Foreign Affairs. She has also been director of the Turkish Studies program at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. As acting Assistant Secretary of State for the Bureau of Educational Cultural Affairs, Dr. Finn was responsible for the State Department's global academic, professional, and youth exchanges, including Fulbright and the International Visitor Program. She also oversaw the Office of Cultural Heritage and Preservation. So with that, we are proud and honored to introduce Dr. Finn.
Thank you so much, David, and thank you so much, Victoria. And he couldn't be here this evening, but I also want to thank Professor El Azad Barkan, who accepted David's nomination for me to join the Institute. So it's a great pleasure to greet you this evening, and friends, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. I'm coming to you in all humility as a practitioner of public diplomacy who's been privileged to represent our country over 3 decades in Europe, the Middle East, South Asia. I entitled this memoir, Cultural Diplomacy and Conflict Resolution, because I wanted to draw attention to the enormous capacity within cultural diplomacy to promote universal values of human rights and ultimately global peace. And let me ask you all now, can you hear me in the back? Is the mic working? Good. As someone who grew up in the Cold War era, I was proud of the institutions that we created after the Second World War and the support we had lent to human rights. It was my hope that in the diplomatic service, I would be able to achieve what Senator Fulbright described as the objective of the academic exchange programs he created, the promotion of mutual understanding. Understanding leads to empathy, and we citizens of the world can benefit from learning about one another. The world has changed dramatically since I entered the Foreign Service in 1980, among the first group of married women allowed to do so. Rapid developments in technology have radically changed our means of communication. Technology is, in of itself, neutral. One of the great steps forward in the last century was the introduction of radio broadcasts, used for the good by President Franklin Roosevelt and used to promulgate unspeakable evil by Adolf Hitler. I began my career at a time when the role of diplomacy was not questioned. Indeed, members of Congress, be they Democrat or Republican, believed in the importance of maintaining dialogue globally. Support for NATO was profound across the board. It was believed that we needed a powerful military to back diplomacy, but diplomacy was seen as the primary means to prevent conflict from occurring in the first place. Support for the European Union, designed to promote democracy, economic prosperity, and human rights, was a cornerstone of our foreign policy. The world was bipolar, and the lines of demarcation were clearly drawn. Diplomats, of course, must remain politically neutral. What separates cultural diplomacy from the other branches is that it is tasked with outreach to the larger public. I'll speak about a conference on postmodernism held in Turkey and later in Pakistan, the opening of a center for democracy in Vienna following the Bosnian War, as well as the performances of the Battery Dance Company in Israel. What was novel is that I used these traditional cultural events to promote conflict resolution. Case study 1, Cold War Cultural Diplomacy, Turkey, 1981 to 1984. Throughout the Cold War, the U.S. and the USSR used cultural diplomacy to win support around the world. The State Department sent Martha Graham to Germany to demonstrate the superiority of American classical high culture. Professor Victoria Phillips has done extensive and very enlightening research on this period. The Russians had the Bolshoi, but we had Paul Taylor and Alvin Ailey. They had Tchaikovsky and Rimsky-Korsakov, but we had Louis Armstrong and Duke Ellington. The world was in love at that time with African-American jazz and blues. Congress willingly supported sending American artists around the globe and stocked American Cultural Center libraries with our greatest works of literature, not necessarily due to aesthetic appreciation, but because we were competing with the Russians. Turkey was a NATO ally with the largest standing army in Europe. But Turkish society was divided at that time between those supporting Turkey's European vocation and those favoring closer ties with Russia. After a period of extreme unrest verging on civil war, a military coup took place in Turkey on September 12, 1980. I arrived to take up my first assignment at Embassy Ankara as assistant cultural attaché not long after that. In terms of Cold War conflict resolution, I was part of a worldwide American diplomatic initiative to win hearts and minds. It was my job to demonstrate that our cultural values, based on freedom of expression with an emphasis on innovation and improvisation, were the way of the future, in contrast to the repression of these same values by the Soviets. We were able to provide the Istanbul Festival with performances of our major dance companies, Pilobolus, Lar Lubavitch, and others. I invited Verdi Trio to give concerts of American classical music. We celebrated the 100th anniversary of the opening of the Brooklyn Bridge in May 1983 with an exhibition about the architect John Augustus Roebling, a German immigrant who had created this masterpiece. There were challenges, of course. A distinguished Harvard professor showed up with a stack of slides at the Middle East Technical University, and guess what? There was a power cut. We managed anyway. I traveled extensively throughout the country, delivering lectures on American literature and history, sometimes in Turkish. And despite the military takeover, we had extraordinary access to the academic community. The 1980s were the heyday of American cultural diplomacy. The journalists, academics, and artists we selected to send to the U.S. came from across the political spectrum. We intentionally sought to invite those from the pro-Soviet left, far left, so that they could see the United States firsthand and make their own judgments. I programmed speakers at odds with official policy to demonstrate the extent to which freedom of thought is an important American value, in stark contrast to the thought control prevalent in the USSR. Our Viennese-born ambassador, Strauss-Hupé, was a conservative political appointee who had been the architect of the Reagan foreign policy at the University of Pennsylvania. When the rector of Ankara University bragged to the ambassador that he had fired leftist members of the faculty, the ambassador, in a moment I shall never forget, responded that Marxism is taught at our universities and no one is sacked. Although Turkey was the second major majority Muslim country after Iran to recognize Israel, tensions were high at the time of the visit of Professor Paul Levine, an expert on Jewish American literature resident in Copenhagen. Paul suggested that I invite a leading scholar of postmodernism, the Egyptian American Professor Ihab Hassan, to visit. This set in motion a conference on postmodernism that traveled from Istanbul to Ankara and Izmir. It included scholars of architecture, music, literature, and dance. One of the highlights was a spontaneous dance performance by Millicent Hodgson at the ancient Greco-Roman amphitheater in Ephesus. This was an example of subliminal messaging on many levels. Turkish faculty and students learned that an immigrant from Egypt could become a full professor at an American university. They learned that an American, Millicent Hodgson, with expertise on Russian ballet, could be invited to speak on behalf of the American embassy. These presentations emphasized our shared aspirations and common humanity, creating bridges between those in Turkey on either side of the Cold War conflict. And lessons learned? The basic lesson I learned in that first posting is we must never betray our own values. Supporting freedom of thought and speech is essential. The visual and performing arts, especially music and dance, communicate so much about us that is worthy of admiration and emulation. I would not have used the term back then, but this was soft power at its very best. Second case, conflict resolution in the Cold War. India and Pakistan, 1984 to 1987, Lahore, 84 to 86. My second Cold War assignment was to another strategic ally, Pakistan. The Russians had invaded Afghanistan in 1979. Pakistan was to play a crucial role in our efforts to oust them. India was at that time still very much in the Soviet sphere. The founding father of Pakistan, Muhammad Ali Jinnah, had wanted a secular state. Unfortunately, Jinnah died in 1948, not long after Pakistan became independent. Its primary identity quickly devolved into religious nationalism. Pakistan differed from Turkey in important ways. Pakistan was created not as a secular republic emerging from the ashes of a defeated empire, but rather as a state rising from colonial rule and dedicated to providing a homeland for the Muslim minority of the Indian subcontinent. The civil service introduced by the British was still intact. The educated classes spoke English as a mother tongue. Women had not been granted equal rights as in Turkey, but many of the most prominent women, including the future Prime Minister Benazir Bhutto, had received Western secondary educations. Overall literacy in Pakistan was abysmally low. The country had invested its resources in the military rather than educating its people. Pakistan was experiencing also rapid population growth. Estimates vary, but it's generally believed that the British partition of India, ending the British Raj, resulted in the deaths of over 1 million people in communal violence, as Muslims sought to make their way across the Red Cliff Line to the new state of Pakistan, and Hindus left Pakistan for India. This is graphically documented in the 2017 historical film drama The Viceroy's House, which makes use of extensive original footage. When I arrived as the Cultural Affairs Officer in Lahore, I found a city of 3.5 million people, many of whom commuted by bicycle in those days before cars engulfed the city with choking smog. Despite the repressive, obscurantist regime of General Zia-ul-Haq, I found a thriving, if sub-rosa, cultural life. I was invited to literary evenings, sitar concerts, and performances of Kathak dance in private homes. Rudyard Kipling's father had founded the National Academy in Lahore, the National Academy of Arts in Lahore. Punjab University was home to a Department of Fine Arts. The two institutions produced many accomplished painters of contemporary and postmodern works, as well as exquisite miniatures in the finest tradition of the subcontinent. The best and brightest young men went abroad to England or the United States for higher education, but young women attended Kinnaird College, a renowned institution that produced leaders in many fields. The principal of Kinnaird, Mira Failbus, a Christian, later served as Minister of Education and Minority Affairs in the Punjab government. When Pakistanis visited my office for a cup of tea, I often asked them whether they viewed Pakistan as culturally part of the Middle East or the Indian subcontinent. Those in the artistic sphere invariably chose the latter, India, while those of a more conservative, religious bent chose the former, the Middle East. Crossing the border to India in those days was fraught with complications. Our cultural center had been attacked earlier, the office I worked in. We had security measures in place. The plan was that should we have to evacuate, we would depart from a rear window and descend the fire escape to an alley. I kept a burqa in my desk just in case I had to depart precipitously and meld into the crowd. On one occasion, the police alerted me that a crowd of demonstrators would arrive on motorcycle within minutes. I recognized the leader, one Chowdhury Itizaz Ahsan, a young Cambridge-educated politician who would later enter Parliament and become Minister for Law and Justice in the government of Benazir Bhutto. I went outside and walked up to the gate to meet him. My very presence calmed things down, thank goodness. Instinct told me that it was important to listen. He asked if I would receive a letter. I immediately said that I would. I was a very young, new diplomat. I had no idea whether this was the right thing to do or not. But I decided on the spur of the moment that I would receive the letter. Once I had taken the letter, we chatted for a few moments before he suggested that I jump the gate and join the demonstration. This elicited some laughter and completely diffused a situation that might well have gone in another direction. This very building had been burned down only a few years before the staff was utterly traumatized. Not long after my arrival, Indian Prime Minister Indira Gandhi was assassinated by her own Sikh bodyguards in October 1984, following the destruction of the Golden Temple in Amritsar the previous June. Despite the tumultuous environment in both countries, I decided to embark on my first effort in conflict resolution across borders. I proposed to Washington an expanded version of the Postmodernism Conference. It seemed that to bring Indians and Pakistanis together, the topic should not be Kashmir, the principal dispute between the two countries forever and ever. Instead, I would create common ground by inviting literary figures, academics, visual and performing artists who had a shared subcontinental heritage. I flew to New Delhi to meet with Professor A.N. Kaul, a distinguished scholar of American literature who had studied at Yale. I invited the Jewish poet Nassim Ezekiel from Bombay and a host of other Indian artists and scholars. Once they agreed to come, I had to negotiate with the authorities on both sides of the border. It was a bit of a cliffhanger, but they all arrived safely. Ihab Hassan came from the US, Millicent Hodson from London, as well as scholars from Turkey, a prominent American architect, and academic expert on American film. The two professors from Turkey, unaware that alcohol was banned in Pakistan, had arrived with bottles of vodka in their suitcases. Fortunately, I did not have to call the Turkish embassy to retrieve them from jail because the customs inspector, unfamiliar with the Roman script, had assumed that these two lovely ladies must be carrying rubbing alcohol for a feverish infant and let them through. The broad international composition of the conference participants deflected from interest in discussion of India-Pakistan political disputes. We were there to discuss postmodernism. The writers, artists, architects of Lahore welcomed their visitors graciously. Indians, Pakistanis, Turks, and Americans were able to celebrate their vast and coherent cultural frame of reference. Among the Indians were some who had been born and educated in Lahore. They were reunited with their classmates whom they had not seen since partition. It was an extraordinarily emotional experience. It taught me the importance of creating neutral territory for people on different sides of a conflict. Finding common ground while respecting differences is a means to finding common humanity. I found other ways to overcome negative sentiment by demonstrating that the United States was not simply a great power supporting a military dictatorship for strategic purposes. Mounting an exhibition of original artworks was out of the question due to the security concerns, to say nothing of the lack of climate control and formidable cost of insurance. Our office in the Philippines produced in those days what were called paper shows, large posters of American artworks that could be easily shipped and mounted upon arrival. When we opened the exhibition of American Impressionist painting in Lahore, people lined up in a long queue around the block in the blazing heat to see replicas of paintings by Mary Cassatt, William Merritt Chase, and others. The people of Lahore loved music and dance. When I discovered that a group of 6 singers from the Metropolitan Opera in New York had been invited to Japan and would stop in India, I contacted them and asked them to perform at our cultural center. The auditorium was packed with music lovers who were, for the most part, completely unfamiliar with the operatic tradition. When these powerful voices filled the room, the audience trembled as if struck by an earthquake. They heard selections from Carmen and even some familiar Broadway show tunes. They applauded wildly and demanded an encore. This was a side of America our Pakistani guests had simply never imagined. The retired Air Commodore, a devout Muslim who ran the Quaid-e-Azam Library housed in the former colonial Lahore Gymkhana, invited me to lecture on American literature. I gave talks on Lillian Hillman and other rather subversive authors. There was an enormous curiosity about our society. The use of literature and the visual and performing arts created opportunities for a broader dialogue. Next, Islamabad, 86 to 89. We're still in the Cold War days. I was asked to stay on in Pakistan as the country cultural affairs officer at our embassy in Islamabad. Washington continued to believe that support for the Afghans would ultimately topple the mighty Soviet Union. For this reason, our Fulbright and international visitor exchange programs were the largest in the world. In addition, there was a massive USAID effort designed to promote technical training. I continued to organize major international conferences to promote human rights. The Karachi Conference on the Rule of Law enabled activists Asma Jihangir and her sister Hina Jalani to engage with leading scholars of constitutional law from abroad. These events emphasized the principles of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights formulated in Paris in 1948. Women in particular needed defending. Among the punishments meted out to women who deviated or were deemed to have deviated from the most regressive norms were acid attacks. These took place even among the students at the University of Karachi. In this context, I was invited by the literature department to deliver a lecture on Nathaniel Hawthorne's The Scarlet Letter. The punishment visited upon Hester Prynne by her neighbors in a Puritan village in this iconic American novel seemed quite moderate in comparison with the violence of an acid attack. What stunned me, however, was the extent to which the students were able to relate to a novel written in 1850 about the New England of 1740s. The young people of Pakistan were living in many different eras. While well aware of popular culture in Europe and North America, their lives were circumscribed by mores from a much earlier time. Young women who transgressed these boundaries in Pakistan risked far more than social ostracism. I worked closely with the Smithsonian Institution to obtain permissions for archaeological research, with the Sackler Gallery, with Milo Beach, who was an expert on miniature painting, a brilliant Brooklyn-born scholar, Nikki Keddy, who was an expert on Iran, Shiite Islam, and women in every, she wrote a book about women in every majority Muslim country. She told me that the women of Pakistan were the most impressive of all those she had met traveling around the world, and perhaps because they had so much to struggle against. Despite severe and discouraging quota restrictions at the universities, they repeatedly succeeded in outperforming their male counterparts. African-American jazz musician Kevin Eubanks, blues performer Charlie Bird gave concerts in Islamabad and elsewhere around the country. It was a way to present a more nuanced version of American society and also to communicate with people who did not speak English. Music and dance are so incredibly important in this regard. People can come and enjoy and experience those events when they would not be able to follow an English language lecture. Pakistan was never a truly safe place to work. In 1988, an explosion at the Army ammunition depot outside Rawalpindi sent shells raining across the sky over our office. Some 100 people are estimated to have died. In August the same year, I had to interrupt a music program when news reached me that there had been a plane crash. Our ambassador, Arnie Rafel, and General Zia were dead. The plane had exploded in midair shortly after takeoff. The most senior Pakistani military officer on the plane, General Mirza Aslam Beg, was appointed Army Chief of Staff, replacing Zia. Defying expectations, he allowed the return of Benazir Bhutto to Pakistan and the restoration of democracy and civilian control. She won the election and took over as Prime Minister in December 1988. She was the first woman to be elected head of government in a majority Muslim country. It was a heady time in Islamabad, especially as many of my friends from Lahore were now in her government. In February '89, I found myself back in Lahore for the lovely kite-flying festival of Basant to welcome the spring. When I returned to Islamabad, I realized that something terrible had happened from the expression on the face of my driver, Salim. The cultural center had been attacked by an angry mob furious over the publication in the US of Salman Rushdie's satanic verses. As a student of literature, I knew that this novel was magical realism, not meant to be taken literally. However, Muslims around the world were not making that distinction. Lessons learned: it's possible to be effective despite the security threats. You just have to get out there. I was out and about and a guest in tens, if not hundreds, of Pakistani homes. In terms of conflict resolution, the Postmodernism Conference brought together Indians and Pakistanis in a safe sphere of shared aesthetics. The inclusion of the Europeans and the Egyptian American also added to the emphasis on finding commonalities. Cultural diplomacy is traditionally the effort to promote one's country through its art forms. This is the quintessential soft power so clearly elucidated by Joseph Nye. I learned one of the best ways to win the affections of people imbued with very different cultural values is to demonstrate respect for their art forms. Next, off to Germany, and this is post-Cold War 1992-95. The fall of the Berlin Wall, November 9th, 1989, 30 years ago, was perhaps the single most significant event in the collapse of the Soviet Union. German euphoria was shared around the world. The global shifting of tectonic plates resulted, however, in unanticipated consequences, unleashing the rise of ethnic nationalism in Yugoslavia. A federation of 6 republics set up after World War II, its people had been permitted to travel abroad because there was little concern that they would not return. Joseph Tito had instituted a positive policy regarding the treatment of the various ethnic groups. When he died in 1980, this began to unravel. With the collapse of the USSR, the ferociously nationalist Serbian leader Slobodan Milosevic had emerged. Throughout Yugoslavia, those identifying as Yugoslavs were losing out to the forces of ethnic exclusivity and intolerance. Our ambassador Warren Zimmerman had tried to focus the attention of Washington, but to no avail. In Germany, Foreign Minister Hans-Dietrich Genscher had persuaded Chancellor Helmut Kohl to recognize Croatia in 1991. War broke out in 92. Zimmerman argued for military intervention, but this did not occur until after much devastation had ensued. With great reluctance, the Bosnians declared independence, not wanting to be divided between Serbia and Croatia, and fully anticipating a bloodbath. Unlike other regions of the Balkans, Bosnia had remained relatively internally peaceful, as documented by the anthropologist Tuna Bringa after spending 6 years living in a mixed Croatian-Bosnian town north of Sarajevo. Secular intermarriage was common, especially in the urban areas. When the war came, families were torn apart. During the siege of Sarajevo, Serb residents of urban apartment buildings went to the hills to work as snipers shooting at their own former neighbors. Must also say that Muslim and Croat, and there were so many mixed families, were also hiding and protecting their Serb neighbors who chose not to become part of the sniper attacks. It was into this European turmoil that I stepped in the summer of '92. Frankfurt was a consulate, our 7th largest mission in the world. Although the Cold War had ended, there was still a huge military presence, including the Army's 5th Corps. Our cultural center was known as the America House. These cultural centers had been established throughout Germany and Austria following World War II in the spirit of the Marshall Plan. Germans could participate in policy conferences and engage in discussion about transatlantic relations, attend concerts, exhibitions of paintings, photography, and avail themselves of our libraries. Our Frankfurt events were attended by many prominent residents, such as Joschka Fischer, who later became Germany's foreign minister. The Frankfurt Book Fair, begun in 1454, soon after Johannes Gutenberg had developed the printing press in nearby Mainz, interrupted by World War II, had resumed in 49 and become the largest in the world. During the book fair and throughout the year, we hosted America's most famous writers of the time: Gore Vidal, Susan Sontag, Richard Ford, Paul Kennedy, Thomas Crichton, and a host of others. Excerpts from New York novelist Louis Begley's Wartime Lies were read at the Jüdische Gemeinde to an audience too large for us to accommodate at the America House. This event demonstrated to me the extent to which Germans had learned to confront the darkest chapter of their past. We sent Petra Roth, later the first woman to become mayor of Frankfurt, to Washington on a professional exchange program. We offered concerts and every imaginable kind of American music, from contemporary classic, someone came from Juilliard, to Zydeco. And you get a prize if you know what that is. We organized conferences on the influence of American jazz and blues on German dissidents in the years leading up to World War II. In recognition of the situation in Bosnia, we invited Edward Sirota to exhibit his moving photographs documenting the tragic exodus of Jews from their homes in Sarajevo. I wrote a message to Ambassador Richard Holbrooke in Bonn about an article in the New York Review of Books, according to which satellite imagery had captured truckloads of Bosnian men being driven out of the northern town of Brčko, the trucks only to return empty. This prefigured the large-scale genocide to follow a few years later in Srebrenica. It was the American journalist Roy Gutman and his German cameraman who brought the Serb-run concentration camps filled with starving Bosnian men to the attention of the world. After World War II, everyone had said, never again, but this was again, and in Europe. In 1993, when Roy won the Pulitzer Prize for A Witness to Genocide, I invited him to read at the America House. Michelle Friedman, a prominent leader of the Jewish community, spoke eloquently and movingly about his support for the Bosnians. Daniel Cohn-Bendit, known as Danny the Red from his days in Paris, 1968, a few of us here will recognize that, now a member of the Greens, also accepted my invitation to speak. Before launching into an impassioned plea for action in Bosnia, he told the audience he had not been to the America House since the anti-Vietnam War protests. In the case of Bosnia, he was a supporter of American military intervention. Steven Spielberg's film, Schindler's List, opened in Frankfurt, 1994. Ambassador Holbrooke hosted a reception attended by Spielberg, Liam Neeson, and other members of the cast. Michelle Friedman arrived with his mother and others who had been rescued from the Holocaust by Schindler. Spielberg told the New York Times journalist Craig Whitney that the war in Bosnia was one of the reasons he had made the film. Spielberg provided teachers with guidebooks for discussion with students. This did not translate into unequivocal support for military intervention, however. The experience of the past had rendered almost all Germans pacifists. In his residence in Bonn, Ambassador Holbrooke displayed medals won in World War I by his German Jewish grandfather. He would show them proudly to guests, remarking, "If you had played your cards right, I could be the German ambassador to Washington instead of the American ambassador to Germany." Before he left Germany, he declared his intention to create an American Academy in Berlin on the Wannsee. It opened 3 years later and has hosted a distinguished list of American writers and scholars, including the playwright Arthur Miller, the novelist Jonathan Lethem, journalists Roger Cohen and Anne Applebaum, the historian Angela Stent, and many others. The Academy is now the most vital cultural and intellectual link between Germany and the U.S. at a time when transatlantic ties are severely challenged. What lessons did I learn? That the Marshall Plan was a brilliant decision to rebuild a war-ravaged country following its defeat, rather than seeking punitive measures as had happened with the Versailles Treaty after World War I. Germany can be counted as our most important continental European ally. I saw the extent to which Germans had learned to deal with their past, both the Holocaust and the crimes of the Stasi, the repressive East German security apparatus. Richard Holbrooke perhaps foresaw the American retreat from cultural engagement that precipitated the closure of our cultural centers around the world in the 1990s. Austria, 95 to 97. Austria took a very enlightened view of the Bosnian conflict, attempting to deal fairly with all the factions and generously absorbing enormous numbers of refugees. The Austro-Hungarian Empire had governed the region, taking over from the Ottomans in 1878. Relations amongst the three main warring confessions in Bosnia, Muslims, Roman Catholic Croats, and Orthodox Serbs, had been relatively amicable before the war. Under the Ottomans, many landowners had converted to Islam, largely due to tax incentives. Those working the land retained their Christian identity. These are generalizations, of course. Until World War II, Sarajevo had been home to a large Sephardic Jewish population welcomed by the Ottomans centuries before, when they were expelled from Spain by Ferdinand and Isabella. This population was considerably diminished by the Holocaust. The remaining Jewish community remained neutral during the war, and in fact were hosting people of all the factions in Sarajevo. Vienna had been designated as a platform embassy for our mission in Sarajevo. The National and University Library of Sarajevo, a magnificent building in the Spanish Moorish style, had held some 1.5 million volumes, including 155,000 rare books and manuscripts, representing the cultural and intellectual history of all the confessions of Bosnia. Courageous staff had been able to secure some of the precious illuminated manuscripts before the Serbian shelling caused the destruction of the collection on August 25, 1992, an event that some described as the largest single book burning in history since the destruction by fire of the ancient library in Alexandria. At Embassy Vienna, we decided the rescue of the Sarajevo Library building and restoration of its collection would be a significant, neutral project inclusive of all ethnic communities. Over the following year and a half, the Books for Sarajevo project resulted not only in the collection of book donations for the library, temporarily based in the Tito barracks, but restoration of the building itself under European Union sponsorship. We convened an interfaith conference in Vienna under embassy auspices. The Muslims were represented by the Grand Mufti, Mustafa Ceric, the Roman Catholics by their bishop, the Serbs by a humble Orthodox parish priest who was courageous enough to join us. Jakub Finzi, the leader of the Sephardic Jewish community, served as the facilitator in the discussions. Mustafa Ceric had earned a doctoral degree at the University of Chicago. Jakub Finzi had a law degree. These two were key players in the meetings during which the group hammered out a set of principles beginning a long process of reconciliation. These principles, which valued tolerance, forgiveness, and formulation of all the values of human rights, were communicated to each of the congregations as part of the peace effort. I'm wondering if we want to allow time for questioning, so what do you think?
I think we're okay.
We're okay? Okay. The human tragedy prompted by ultra-nationalism included the destruction of much historic memory. Aside from the Sarajevo Library, Bosnia's cultural heritage was severely damaged. A large number of mosques were obliterated, and along with them, the historic documents contained within. The perpetrators were not just Serbs. Decorative elements in the magnificent 16th century Ottoman Gazi Husrev Beg Mosque in Sarajevo were removed, and countless elegant Ottoman tombstones were defaced by the Saudis. After the war, we were approached by Bosnian Vice President Ayub Ganic with a reconciliation plan to enable meetings amongst the formerly warring ethnic factions. We worked out a tripartite agreement to create a Center for Democracy in neutral Vienna to be sponsored by Austria, Bosnia-Herzegovina, and the United States. It was essential that Bosniaks, Croats, and Serbs should come together to engage in peaceful dialogue. The United States contributed the America House with its magnificent wood-paneled library, conference rooms, and exhibition space, centrally located near the Vienna Rathaus. The Austrians undertook to absorb travel hotel costs for the participants coming to Vienna from Sarajevo. The Bosnians were responsible for identifying and inviting those who were to take part in the dialogue, scrupulously including all major ethnic groups. The America House had been created, again, in the spirit of the Marshall Plan. It's hard to imagine a better use for it. Among those who participated in these discussions and deliberations was Richard Goldstone, the South African judge, who issued key rulings undermining apartheid. He later served as the chief prosecutor for the United Nations International Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia. In attendance as well was Simon Wiesenthal, the renowned Nazi hunter, who was a resident of Vienna. This project, Books for Sarajevo, illustrated the importance of symbolic gestures. The Interfaith Conference was based on the belief in universal human values, human rights, and the Center for Democracy created a venue where representatives of the warring Bosnian factions could meet safely and engage in dialogue. Post-Cold War conflict resolution, Greece and Turkey, 97 to 2000. I'm sorry to say, losing my voice. Turkey and Greece were NATO allies, and this is where David Phillips comes in. But Turkey's relations with Greece had deteriorated rapidly due to the capture of the PKK, Kurdistan Worker Party leader Öcalan under Greek diplomatic auspices in Nairobi. I'm going to have to stop here.
This human tragedy, prompted by ultranationalism, included the destruction of much historic memory. Aside from the Sarajevo Library, Bosnia's cultural heritage was severely damaged. A large number of mosques were obliterated, and along with them, the historic documents contained within. The perpetrators were not just Serbs. Decorative elements in the magnificent 16th century Ottoman Gaz.
It's okay. I did that already. So go
Okay.
here.
After the war, we were approached by Bosnian Vice President Ayub Ganic with a reconciliation plan to enable meetings amongst the formerly warring ethnic factions. We worked out a tripartite agreement to create a Center for Democracy in neutral Vienna to be sponsored by Austria, Bosnia-Herzegovina, and the United States. It was essential that the Bosniaks, Croats, and Serbs should come together to engage in peaceful dialogue. The United States contributed the America House with its magnificent, we did this.
I
already.
did that, yeah.
Okay. The Bosnians were responsible for identifying and inviting those.
We did that,
Okay, 15.
yeah. Okay, I guess we.
Oh, here, okay, sorry. Among those who participated in these discussions and deliberations was Richard did we do this?
Richard Goldstone,
yes.
yeah. What page?
Here, do you want me to?
15, is this what page?
This is 16.
Yeah, we were up to
We-
Greece and Turkey.
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah,
here.
we're up to David Phillips.
Okay. Yes, okay.
Tries to go to
No,
paragraph
of
2.
course, we're back. Sorry. The highly experienced Track 2 facilitator, David Phillips, had arrived at Embassy Ankara in 1998, offering to help with Greek-Turkish dialogue. When the Öcalan crisis emerged, I worked with David to organize a series of meetings between Greeks and Turks in an atmosphere so highly charged that they had to be held surreptitiously under the auspices of a neutral diplomatic representations in Istanbul and Athens. The Swedes offered their consulate in Istanbul for the first round of talks. We decided to invite media owners and journalists to engage, believing that they would be in a position to influence public opinion. Initially, the conversations were quite chilly, but David Phillips, a seasoned mediator, was able to break the ice. I arranged for an evening on the consular yacht, the Hiawatha, for a moonlit cruise on the Bosphorus. The Istanbul meetings were followed by one in which the Turks traveled to Athens, by which time the dialogue had achieved a degree of harmony. These track 2 discussions ended with a splendid starlit evening in a taverna near the magnificently illuminated Acropolis, enabling the Greeks to display their classical heritage in all its glory. The ancestors of these participants had lived together for centuries in the Aegean towns and villages. Track 2 diplomacy makes use of the deep emotional undercurrents that bind people. After all, most conflicts occur between neighbors. When the great Greek singer
Theodorakis.
Theodorakis performed in
Zorba.
Zorba performed in Turkey, he always drew enormous crowds at his open-air concerts. Perhaps those who best understood the profound emotional ties between the two countries were at the Greek Foreign Minister George
Yorgo
Papandreou and his Turkish counterpart, Foreign Minister
Ismail
Cem. In 2001, on the Greek island of Samos, the two men planted an olive tree to symbolize their commitment to peace. This opened a new era of relations between Greece and Turkey. To this day, there is a peace award dedicated to these two men. As a result of our Track 2 efforts with the Greek and Turkish media, when the horrific earthquake struck northwestern Turkey, not far from Istanbul, on August 17, 1999, there was extensive sympathetic media coverage in Greece and an outpouring of sympathy from the Greek people, wildly reported in Turkey. Thanks to the good work of David Phillips, there was a reconciliation in what came to be called Greek-Turkish earthquake diplomacy. In November, President and Mrs. Clinton visited Turkey to demonstrate sympathy for survivors of the earthquake. The president addressed the Turkish parliament. The highlight of the visit was his stop at one of the tent cities outside Izmit, where he shared tea with earthquake survivors. An iconic photo of a Turkish baby pulling on Clinton's nose appeared on the front page of every major daily. The U.S. had a favorable rating in the high 80s in those days, but it shot up to the high 90s as a result of this visit. Although I had worked in the field of conflict resolution in India, Pakistan, and the former Yugoslavia, I had not consciously employed Track 2 diplomacy. This is something I learned from David Phillips. The benefit derived from putting decision makers together in private settings reinforced my belief in the efficacy of person-to-person dialogue. In Pakistan, I had brought together Indian and Pakistani artists and writers to discuss their shared interest in the postmodern aesthetic movement, opening a space for more extensive engagement. In Austria, the creation of the Center for Democracy had provided a venue where adherents to the Bosnian factions could meet safely. The Vienna interreligious dialogue had dealt with shared ethical values rather than with arguments about the history of the conflict itself. Lessons learned. The Greek-Turkish Track 2 meetings were a step forward in the sense that high-powered individuals from both sides of a bitter conflict were brought together to directly discuss the conflict. It was essential to emphasize the shared cultural values of the participants rather than abstract aesthetic or legal concepts. Building on this initial effort, we proceeded to organize meetings of historians, diplomats, academics, and former military officers. Cultural diplomacy is uniquely suited to this endeavor. Should I keep going?
It's up to the audience. Sorry, we do want to do Q&A. It's up to you.
We've got public and cultural diplomacy, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, 2003 to 2007.
Maybe people want to hear that.
Despite the, yes, okay.
What's the vote?
Yes, I think we've got to go.
The rest, do you want to
Well,
hear
we've
the rest of the
got
talk?
both, yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Despite the treaties with Egypt 1979 and Jordan 1994 and the Madrid Peace Conference, the Oslo Accords, and the efforts of President Clinton, by the time I arrived at Embassy Tel Aviv, no comprehensive peace agreement had been reached. The efforts of Ami Ayalon, a former head of Shin Bet, and distinguished Professor Sari
Nusseibeh.
Thank you.
Palestinian professor Sari Nusseibeh.
Had produced the People's Voice, a peace initiative advocating a two-state solution supported by many in the security and intelligence community. However, it had not gained wider traction. The demographic issue had come to the fore as a result of the research of two scholars, the Italian-born Sergio della Pergola and one of the founders of Hafta University, Arnon Sofer, an Israeli geographer. According to their calculations, the Jewish population of Israel would not continue indefinitely to constitute a majority. This raised the probability that Jewish Israelis might have to make a stark choice between retaining the Jewish character of the country or retaining its democracy if a two-state agreement could not be reached. At the embassy in Tel Aviv, I oversaw the implementation of the Wye River Memorandum signed by Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu and PLO Chairman Yasser Arafat, 1998. Along with many other stipulations, it had designated $10 million for cooperative Israeli-Palestinian efforts in fields such as emergency medicine, water management, education, civil society, shared history, and archaeology. The concept behind this was that direct engagement between the two peoples was essential to creating the atmosphere for peace. The Wye River grants were not used to bring people together to discuss the conflict. They were used to bring people together to solve problems, share professional interests, understand other perspectives, and to pursue joint projects in the expectation that these two peoples would eventually be living side by side in peace. They were intended to build trust. Even after some of the worst episodes of bloodshed, the Wye River Grant participants continued to attend our meetings and remained in touch with one another. Dr. Mark Allen Davis oversaw Harvard University's effort to promote conflict resolution through emergency medicine. Yossi Alfer, a former senior official of the Mossad, and his co-editor,
Yasem Khatib.
produced Bitter Lemons, an internet publication creating a space for civilized dialogue. Dan Barton and Sami Adwan.
Dan Baron. And Sami Adwan.
Developed an Arab-Israeli reader entitled Side by Side, Parallel Histories of Israel-Palestine. One of the most moving efforts was the Parent Circle Forum, meetings of bereaved parents from both sides of the conflict that had been started by Yitzhak Frankenthal after losing his beloved son, Arik. Perhaps the most memorable event of my tour was the 80th birthday celebration of Shimon Peres at the Man Auditorium in Tel Aviv, September 2003. Seated with Ariel Sharon, Peres received accolades from a host of world leaders, including President Clinton, who joined a chorus of Jewish and Arab children singing the John Lennon song, Imagine. The American Cultural Center in Jerusalem had remained open. Under the leadership of our center director, it became a place for Jewish and Arab Israeli youth to meet. I sought the support of the State Department to open American corners in Akko Jaffa, Beersheba, and Carmel, all areas with mixed Jewish and Arab populations. I invited Jonathan Hollander and the Battery Dance Company from New York to work with Jewish and Arab students in Jaffa to create unique dances. Following a directive from the White House, Ambassador Daniel Kurtzer hosted an interfaith iftar dinner during Ramadan, to which representatives of all the major confessions were invited. Lessons learned. When I served in Israel, there was a genuine yearning for a lasting peace based on the two-state solution. Efforts such as the Wye River grants were designed to put people in differing perspectives together to work on projects of mutual professional interest. The other side of the coin is the debilitating and brutalizing effect on both sides of a prolonged conflict. Looking forward, policy recommendations. I am struck by the number of former members of our civil and military services who have recently sought elected office across the United States. It occurs to me that this desire to serve our country, to promote peace, is an echo of the same impetus that led many idealistic young people of my generation to join the Peace Corps or the Foreign Service. The difference is that in the days of John F. Kennedy, we thought about healing the world. Now it seems those officials are hoping to heal the divisions at home. It is to be hoped that they will place the values that have made this country worth fighting for above partisan politics. they will surely understand the benefits of cooperation with our most trusted allies. Some of the strongest advocates for the State Department have been our military commanders. They understand the importance of diplomacy in preventing war. Conflict prevention and resolution must be at the heart of all of our efforts. Throughout 3 decades of working in the field of public and cultural diplomacy, I saw firsthand how effective these efforts could be. Public and cultural diplomacy approaches to conflict resolution can be broken down into 4 categories. The first of it is exemplified by the Postmodern Conference. It was not just a case of exhibiting American expertise, it was an exercise in soft power going in both directions. The second category is exemplified by the creation of the Center for Democracy in Vienna. It brought together willing representatives of the warring parties in a neutral setting under the auspices of the Austrian and American governments. The third category is exemplified by Track 2 diplomacy. It involved dialogue between the opposing parties dealing directly with the conflict and exploring their respective grievances. These conversations made the earthquake diplomacy possible. The fourth category is represented by the Wye River grants. When individuals enthusiastic about saving lives, restoration of cultural heritage, or the preservation of precious resources come together, they relate to one another on multiple levels. Demonization of the other is diminished. The Norwegians understand that this is when they called the meetings that led to the Oslo Accords. Perhaps the most important lesson learned is that we must absolutely remain true to our values. Intellectual freedom, press freedom, freedom of speech are enshrined in our Constitution. Truth is of the utmost importance in building trust. It is a demonstration of our strength as a nation that we permit free debate, even on controversial subjects. Bringing both sides of an issue to light is not the same as moral equivalency. Only by examining opposing views can we begin to consider ways in which we can build bridges and heal wounds. I cannot emphasize strongly enough the power of music, dance, and the visual arts to achieve conflict resolution. Battery Dance has performed most often in cooperation with our embassies and consulates in over 70 countries around the world, including truly dangerous places such as northern Iraq and the Congo. During the Cold War and beyond, there was unequivocal support for the European Union, NATO, open markets, and free trade. There was a belief that support of our treaty commitments was a matter of integrity. We sought to inspire trust. When I look to the future, I recommend that we recruit talented young people to the Department of State who have the personnel skills and the intellectual capacity to interact with people from cultures very different from our own. Our diplomats must be able to read the minds and hearts of those with whom they are interacting. They should employ the kinds of conflict resolution techniques I have outlined, but I also recommend that they improvise to reach their counterparts effectively. It might be said that I, quote, made it up as I went along, end quote, and that is what I would hope to do, and that is what I would hope they will do as well. While it is important that they be grounded in the language, history, and culture of the country to which they are assigned, it is also important that they be given the breathing space to innovate and adapt.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Victoria. Thank you. Okay.
All right. Thank you so much. I'm really sorry about that. I did a lot. I spoke with Victoria's class for 2 hours today. I have a cold and lost my voice there for a while. However, I've had a lozenge and some water, so I'm okay now.
And I apologize for butchering the names.
Oh, no, how would you, I know, I'm the Ayalon, and yeah.
So I think we'll open up the discussion up to questions and answers, and I'll allow you to choose people.
I'm very happy, yes. I recognize some faces from Victoria's class, but no one has any questions, I guess. Yes, Jonathan.
Well, I've always wondered, because you're so smart and you engage so well with all of these different regions of the world, and you improvised. And as I go around to different embassies and see what's been going on in more recent times, I felt that people who behave the way you behave have been punished and have not, their careers have not flourished. And so I've always wondered how you managed to do what you do and have done so effectively. Did you?
I broke a lot of rules. I broke a lot of rules,
Were you
but
just lucky
I
with
was
the
given.
bosses
I
that-
was very lucky. I worked for wonderful. In the longer document that David Phillips put online, the Institute for the Study of Human Rights. You can all look at that on the website, but I go into much more detail about that. But I worked. Dan Kurtzer in Israel, Mark Paris in Turkey. I worked for very, very wonderful, Phil Murphy in Germany. I worked for wonderful ambassadors. They gave me a free hand. In fact, when I was in Ankara, I remember that someone said, why are you letting Helena do this, that, and the other? And the ambassador said, no, that's it. Let her go. Let her do it. So the other thing was, and this came up in the class earlier today, our Congress designated funds. I had no trouble with funding during the Cold War. When the Cold War ended, it disappeared. The whole cultural diplomacy was absorbed into the State Department, and I have to say, the State Department had housed cultural diplomacy earlier, but during the Cold War there was a strong commitment to it. So it was enmeshed in a much larger bureaucracy, and the State Department is starved for funds. It's absolutely starved for funds. So our congressional decision makers just weren't allocating money for this. And I was fortunate in Germany. When I was doing these programs in Frankfurt, I got money from the German banks. We were allowed to accept sponsorship, and I created a little, brochure that went out every month with all of our programs. And the German banks would advertise on the back page, discreetly. This is done with a grant from Mobil Oil kind of thing that you used to hear on PBS. So I did do that, and it was raising money for. There was so much. Older Germans were just so determined to support the transatlantic relationship. And my staff in Frankfurt, I had a beautiful office with a huge table aside from my desk, and they would lay out a spread of 11 o'clock in the morning, all kinds of salamis and cheeses and champagne, and invite these bankers over, and then they gave us money. It was really, it was easy. And the rule was we were allowed to accept these funds, these sponsorships, but anything extra would go back to the Treasury. It had to go to Washington. But it worked out usually that it came out even. So it was. The other thing was, I have to say this also, when I was in Frankfurt, the city of Frankfurt sponsored, I had a lovely home. My colleagues at the consulate had lovely homes. We entertained, particularly in my job, it was extremely important. The US government was paying $1 a year. And this is a long time after the end of the Second World War. It's paying $1 a year, a token payment for these beautiful homes. I think by now they've probably been sold off, but it was really quite an extraordinary level of support. And in the 90s, I had to, I had to be more innovative in terms of figuring out how to cover these programs. Jonathan, did you want to say? Well, I'll take questions, but I want you to say a few words about Battery Dance also, just to explain some of the experiences, because this is quintessential cultural diplomacy. Okay, who? Yes.
Would you say that you saw the principles of cultural diplomacy, namely like cultural and contextual, historical analysis and kind of like mutual understanding applied in the political decision making around you, or like the foreign policy aspect of conflict resolution? Would these two interact?
Yes, to some extent. First of all, when I was a cultural affairs officer, I was doing exchange programs. Politics, of course, is in everything. Whom you choose for the exchange programs, for professional exchange. As I think I mentioned, We would send people, when I was in Turkey in the Cold War, from the far left, intentionally. People who were pro-Soviet intentionally, so they'd have a chance to see the United States and form their own judgments. So yes, it was in everything, but when I became, when I was the public affairs officer, I oversaw both the cultural side and the press. And the press officers are the ones who get out there and talk about policy. What they say, it was never my choice to be a press officer, because what the press officers do, they're restricted. They have to just, this is the policy as it comes from Washington. They can't give their own opinions. And over the years, I had many, many friends who were journalists, and when I trusted them, I spoke with them very frankly and told them what I thought, whether I, in cases when I didn't agree with a particular policy. So every element of the embassy has a different role, but the political officers are analyzing the situation in the country at the time and reporting to Washington so it has a better understanding of what's going on. The ambassador is the main spokesperson for policy, and after that you have, I had the right to be one of the speakers on policy issues, and so did the press officer. Yes?
How did you see the economic officer role vary between countries?
The responsibilities of people in these positions are the same, but of course the situations in countries are very different. At very large embassies, the economics affairs department of the embassy covers a lot of things. It covers, climate change issues. It covers global issues, as well as direct economic issues with that country. So there's a tremendous variation, but there was a great variation in what kinds of things I could and could not do in all these different countries I served in. So yeah, it's hard to give one simple answer to that.
What's the funding situation now for culture?
Terrible.
And because they used
Terrible.
to have SIA offices, installation offices.
That was closed down.
A long time ago.
Yes, it was closed down in the 90s.
Wow.
It was closed because Francis Fukuyama said it was the end of history. The Soviet Union collapsed. We won. And then there was this terrible period of hubris. We're the sole superpower. We don't have to do anything. And that's when the emphasis on outreach, language proficiency, and many other things deteriorated. Yes?
And as a follow-up question to that, what do you think the State Department can do now to reinvigorate our cultural diplomacy, especially as we're seeing a lot of rivals doing it better than we?
Well, when there is a vacuum, there's a very large country that will, at some time in the future, if things continue in the current trajectory, overtake us as the leading economic power. And they're everywhere in the world, and they're doing soft power diplomacy. They're in Africa. There's a young lady, I don't think she's here tonight, in the class from that country, and I had a chat with her afterwards, and she talked about working in Africa. I'm very concerned about the UN, because when we don't fund the UN, that creates a vacuum. In fact, we're creating vacuums all over the place. What can be done? Remember, the State Department has to be funded by Congress, so Congress has to understand, and this was something that was really, truly bipartisan. Republicans and Democrats had no question about the importance of supporting this. It just fell apart in the 90s, and the cultural centers were closed in almost everywhere. And after that, there were a few that were allowed to stay open. But after that, people in cultural offices just had to wing it, so to speak. Yes?
So this year there were about 300 venues that opened in different parts of the world. And so
I couldn't hear you. There were how many?
This year there were about 300 venues that opened in different parts of the world.
300 what?
Venues?
Venues, so based like sort of replicas of the Venice venue.
Biennial.
Oh, biennials, yeah, uh-huh.
And it's of Venice with the way it's set up, with the national pavilions,
Mhm.
and the way
Right.
it's ritualized, right? Every year,
Right.
every summer, there's
Right.
cultural producers
Uh-huh.
from each of these countries that organize around topics that are informed by the media, the press, the events, the political events. But it seems to me that these activities don't necessarily get a lot of attention from people that are involved in governments, in diplomacy. So,
Mhm.
you know, we're seeing there's no funding for cultural diplomacies within the embassy spaces, but these activities exist outside in the world of artistic
Of course.
institutions.
Yes.
So I'm wondering, what are your thoughts
Well-
on connecting these two worlds, or?
Well, actually, we did, during the Cold War days, we were involved in all kinds of fairs, and we had a whole office that did exhibitions. I couldn't bring real artworks to Pakistan because of the security situation and the climate and so on. But there was an office that sent exhibitions out. It wasn't just dance companies, and it was everything. And and there was that kind of coordination as well. And what a lot of our cultural officers have done now, and I had to start doing this in my final tour was in Berlin, was scouring the newspapers and the media to see which American performing companies were coming, and then I would contact them and make sure that the ambassador was involved. And Ambassador Murphy was wonderful. He hosted receptions for everybody. So the embassy got connected to those cultural events. You have to remember also, in wealthy countries, there are entrepreneurs. I mean, when I was growing up, Sol Yurok brought the Bolshoi to New York. You know, there were entrepreneurs who do those things. So the government doesn't have to do all of it. But you have to think about this. There are many countries in the world that don't have the means, you know, to support this kind of artistic development. And those are the places where it's more important than ever that we do get involved. Another thing is, our country does not have a Ministry of Culture. France has a Ministry of Culture. It's
Most countries
really
have a
important.
India.
India, of
countries
course,
have it.
yes, it's really important. We don't have this. It's, in fact, when I was an acting assistant secretary in this Bureau of Educational and Cultural Affairs, when a cultural minister came to visit us, I was the person who met them. I was we didn't have a minister of culture, a secretary of culture. So that's another thing about the overall American society. Sports are very important. Because New York has such a profound cultural life, and our other big cities, whether it's Houston or Chicago or Los Angeles, our other big cities do as well. But in a lot of the country, I don't think so much is going on, and I don't think people understand if their congressman or congresswoman is going to vote for funds.
Just piggybacking on that, if I think back on the interwar years with Roosevelt, when he wanted to do cultural diplomacy and the Congress wasn't terribly inclined to fund it, he partnered with Rockefeller.
Yes.
So is there any possibility of, in this period where Congress might not be eager to fund, that there would be
Well,
partnerships
it
with
has to come
foundations?
from first of all, it has to come from the top. The president. This was the president who said, this is a good thing to do. That makes a difference.
Yes.
That's a big help. But we were, for instance, when it was just before 9/11, but we were working with Soros. We were going to do cultural exchange with Iran. And, you know, and very strictly cultural topics, miniature, you know, people who restore miniatures or who paint miniatures, things like that, that no one could say there was any other objective involved in it. And we also, at that time, Biden was interested in public-private partnerships. But even long ago, It wasn't that the U.S. government paid, the taxpayers paid every penny for a symphony orchestra or a dance company. It was still a public, the foundations and corporations were very happy to be involved as sponsors. So it was, but the government organized it. And the government, of course, understood the situation on the ground in that other country and knew what could work and what couldn't and had people there to set it up.
Helena, I was just
Oh, and Allison, you have, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, in the early 2000s, many of the embassies, especially countries like China, took on a new model where they had American art in the missions, in the embassies.
Right.
And showcased American art specifically. But they all took on similar ways of being built. The new embassies in India, China, were all the same model with American art housed in those buildings in a huge way, where they even had brochures when you walked into these embassies.
Well,
and you could
we had this in Berlin, Judy. It's Joe Carroll Lauder and a private organization called FAPE, FAPE. It's Foundation for Art and Preservation in Embassies around the world. They have selected, so I think it's Beijing, the new consulate in Istanbul, there are certain, and the Berlin embassy. These are wealthy private people who raised the money to do this. There is also an art collection somewhere in the basement of the State Department. When my husband Robert was our ambassador to Dushanbe and had a residence in Almaty, he was able to get a magnificent collection of American art. That's art that has been donated to the State Department. Ambassadors who care about, some ambassadors have their own collections, but ambassadors who care about it can select them and display those artworks. But that's a relatively small program. What Joe Carroll Lauder and the people in that group did was fantastic. But they raised a lot of money. They also got very prominent artists like Sol LeWitt and others to donate works. So the American Embassy in Berlin has a great collection, and I know this is true in other places as well. Allison, I'm sorry.
I just wanted to ask a question whether you see anywhere in different countries cultural programs that are very successfully run and contribute towards political understanding. I'm thinking particularly of the Germans who have extended God knows how much money to writers, say from throughout Eastern Europe. One of the biggest writers in Russia right now. They originally came to the West on the DAAD.
Right. I'm now in one of my roles.
I'm putting you on the spot.
No, not at all, not at all.
But I think, is there a way to make that resonate through it and talk to people in Congress and sort of say?
Do you think?
No,
I think it. No, they. You know, for some of them, I don't like to say, they don't even appreciate how important Europe is.
Yeah.
They don't appreciate. And I think Germany, France, Italy have magnificent. You know, here there are several locations in this city alone with representation from Germany and France. But it's also something that is a very high value in those societies at large, and so I think there's a willingness to promote these cultural values. And I'm saying, because we have such wonderful artists, we have such wonderful musicians, and we have such wonderful dancers. It shouldn't be a struggle to find support for this, but to say, we should do this because the French do it or the Germans do it. I don't.
No.
I wish, maybe we should do it because of Shen Yun.
Yes.
That might, I don't know. I don't like to think that, that would be the motivation. We should do it because it's the right thing to do.
Right.
But yeah, I wish I could give a more positive answer.
No, I'm raising it just to get the topic percolating through people's minds.
Yes, right.
It's such an obvious way.
Right. Yes.
I'm not sure if there's an obvious answer to this, but my question sort of to piggyback off of your
cultural appreciation beginning? Do you think it has to begin at a level of higher learning, such as many like private institutions, like such as Columbia, who slashed, many humanities departments are beginning to, prioritize the sciences more?
Victoria mentioned that I've come and spoken to her class over the last 6 years, and I have been here as a visiting scholar for the last 2 years. I do want to interact with students and young people because I hope some of them will consider going into the diplomatic service, and they will think about making this case from within. Mm-hmm. But what people really have to do, and I've said this to other audiences so many times over the years, you have to contact your congressman or your congresswoman and tell them this is important. And it's a hard sell. Mm-hmm. Yes?
And then piggybacking off that, what advice would you give to someone who's interested in going into a career in the State Department?
Basically, our State Department does not require any particular kind of degree. It's a written exam. You take an exam, and then there are a battery of other oral exams and other things. You have to jump through a certain number of hoops. But I think it's been a wonderful career. I think it's much more difficult now than it was. On the other hand, in many ways, it's better. For example, I don't like to bring up sad stories, but I had older colleagues who lost children because in India actually, because they were in a consulate in a remote place and there was no medical care. There were a lot of sacrifices involved also, and dangerous conditions. So those circumstances are better. On the other hand, people do have to suffer very serious pollution and climate issues all around the world, and also these terrible global medical problems, Ebola and other such things. I mean, colleagues working in Africa are dealing with that. So, but what I would say is go for it. It's going to be very different from what I described to you because I was trying to capture the way things were in the Cold War, but also to inspire you to think about how we might better be representing ourselves abroad and better communicating with people from other countries. Mm-hmm. And we have the UN right here in New York City, and that's supposed to be a place where a lot of this is happening.
And you don't have to take an exam.
No, you don't have to take an exam. Yes, you should. But again, we have to support it. We have to support it. Yes?
How much of the cultural diplomacy is language? How many of the language do you speak of the countries you work with?
Well, okay, I can tell you.
Your husband speaks all of them.
Lots and lots of, yes, he speaks everything.
Do you speak all of the languages also?
I studied French and then some dead languages, Latin and Anglo-Saxon English in school. And I in the Foreign Service, first of all, I went out to teach in Turkey. So I taught myself Turkish, and then I did have some training to smooth out my grammar. So that was the language I used extensively in 2 tours. When I went to Pakistan, because the entire society that we dealt with in diplomatic service was English speaking, I didn't have Urdu language training. However, Robert, who was a political officer, did, because in his job it was required, in my job it was not considered necessary. The same thing was true of Israel. I had a couple of weeks of Hebrew training, but I didn't really, it wasn't enough to acquire real fluency. And then I got there and everybody I was dealing with, again, it was in English. And in fact, when I walked down the street, most often people would address me in Russian. They thought, no, American. So I'm just.
And you speak German.
And German, of course, yes. But I came to German mid-career because that was my first assignment, and I had German language training, and then I had a refresher course because it was 13 years later. I had been other places, and then I went back to Berlin. So German, yes. And I don't know, I know a little bit of Greek and, a smattering of Urdu and so on.
So I think your answer to the woman in front of me is learn a lot of languages.
No, okay, here's what here's what, first of all, because it's a well-known fact that Americans cannot speak foreign languages, we don't have a language requirement for entrance to the Foreign Service. Now, European diplomats speak their mother tongues, let's say it's Italian, and then they speak English, and then they speak usually one other European language. But our diplomats are going to, since English is a universal language, our diplomats are trained in all the languages of the world. But basically, after you're admitted, you have a certain length of time to qualify at a certain level, either in two of the easier languages, or if you do one of the really difficult ones, Chinese or Japanese or Urdu or Arabic, then you might not have to ever do another language. So it's more important to have a depth of knowledge of one or two languages than to and remember, languages are families. So for instance, if you know Turkish, you can speak to people in Azerbaijan and to some extent to people across Central Asia in the Turkic republics. And that got Latin languages, that's you get Slavic languages, that's right. If you learn Ukrainian, you can speak to Poles and so on. So, yes. And they give you a language test. And if you get a high score, they'll train you in a difficult language. And if you get a medium kind of score, they'll train you in an easier language.
Do you want to?
Would you, yeah, Jonathan, I'd like you to say a few words about that.
But I want to bring up Imad Salem because he's a graduate of the SIPA program.
We have 3 people here from Battery, and Judy
We're
Killinger
overwhelming
also.
you.
Yeah.
I'm the founder of Battery Dance Company. It's a dance company here in New York that is in its 44th year. And 8.5 years ago, Imad joined us, and he graduated from SIPA. So I think actually it's this combination that speaks to a lot of what Helena was talking about. Do you want to talk about how your education and your background has been implemented in going overseas with a dance company?
Yeah, sure. So before joining Battery Dance, I had very little experience in the arts and in the dance world. Well, first let me just say, completely blown away, Helena, by your experiences and all that you did all around the world.
There's a Turkish word, estağfurullah, means I don't accept that. You have an Arabic
yeah,
also.
Arabic as well.
You don't accept.
That's one of the words
I can't accept this compliment.
No, but for everything that you've done to promote peace and the truth of our common humanity, as well as U.S. interests as well, completely blown away. So thank you. But before joining Battery, I had very little experience with the arts and with dance, and so what I brought, my background was all in international development. I studied here at the SIPA program in the EPD cone. I don't know if that still exists anymore. That was 2009 when I graduated. Joined Battery shortly after that, and what I brought to it was all of the international development and hardcore SIPA kind of training that
I had none of.
Well, no. And so what that meant was bringing in, a really strong monitoring and evaluation system for our cultural diplomacy program. So everything Helena was saying regarding all of the case studies and how cultural diplomacy projects created an impact in the areas that she worked. We have statistics to actually show the statistically significant changes in youth development indicators, conflict resolution indicators, and other indicators.
Metrics.
We have the metrics. After a 1-week dance program, we're able to show a 150% increase in positive perceptions towards Americans in the United States. We're able to show a 150% increase in positive perceptions between Israelis and Palestinians. And so that has introduced a whole new way of kind of advocating for cultural diplomacy and its use.
Right.
For with the government, and so that's just a little element of. But we're starting to also think about a couple years ago we helped launch the South Africa's first international dance festival in Cape Town, and so looking at my SIPA training in economics, it was how can we use this festival and this development of the festival, get it out into the poorer townships as a way of sparking economic development in those townships, so we can start impacting the youth there and start reducing the rates of violence in those townships. So,
and I'm thinking about Greece, where we started a program in conjunction with the embassy where our Dancing to Connect, which is our signature arts education program, just in a nutshell, we work with people with or without any prior dance training, and after a 20-hour workshop, the groups have made their own pieces of choreography. So we sort of turn this whole idea of the expert professional coming with a prefabricated product and, you know, having the participants imitate, we turn that upside down. And that's a very American idea, I think. We're promoting creative thinking, and we're saying that anyone and everyone can be creative. We're giving a license to you to make a piece of dance. And so we just came back from Canada, where we had our first program. It's kind of strange. We've been in 70 countries this way and that way, but never that way. And we went to Canada, and you would think that everything would be the same and it would be very easy, but it was not at all. We were working with primarily minority students and went into the National Ballet School, where every single picture on the wall was white people, not a single dark face. And so something was happening. We created a change, and guess who funded that program? NATO. NATO at 70 realized that Canadians had no idea why Canada, young students in Canada had no idea what NATO was. In fact, one student out of all the students we worked with had even heard the name. And we promoted the idea that if we implanted the idea of collaboration among different people creating a platform for peace and security, that this was something that we could actually have a deep learning experience with these young people, where they could really find a way into this concept of NATO and what NATO is. And so 2 of these groups performed for 500 international educators 2 days ago in Toronto, and demonstrated what they could actually do, what they could achieve by putting aside their differences and working together for one goal which they would share. And it was an incredible thing. And the president of NATO in Canada was there in the front row, just totally bowled over by what he saw, as did these educators. But coming back to Greece, it was the rise of the Golden Dawn Party when we went to Athens. And the Golden Dawn Party was targeting high school students during recess when they were out in the field, in the playground or whatever, and putting forth the message that, your parents are out of work. You know why? Because those people who look different, who came into our country, they're taking over everything. So if you see people who look different, you should attack them, because then you're doing something that's positive for our country. And so we were asked by the embassy to embed in these workshops that we were doing the idea of, mutual trust and acceptance and anti-violence and anti-xenophobia. And some incredible works were done that were then performed on the Opera House stage at the Onassis Cultural Center with 800 people in the audience. So it was not only the 100 young people who were in these workshops, but it was also this greater community that came to watch them, and the families and parents. And I'll never forget that the ambassador who introduced us said, somehow jovially, that this was one event that he could go to where nobody would have a problem with American policy. And bottom line, that program started by Americans and then shared with Greek teaching artists who are very, very talented. 7 years later, it's been to 7 parts of Greece, keeps coming back to Athens every year, but we set in motion something that is spiraling out and has no signs of diminishing. It's just continuing. So, I think it's, as an American and as an artist, I feel very proud when my teaching artists are actually out in the field doing these projects, because we were not told ever that we're supposed to telegraph a pro-American message, or that we have to be on a certain political side.
I'm against it.
I'm
absolutely. Yeah, there
Well,
was.
Richard Ford said that at the conference
Yeah,
at Columbia
right.
where you spoke.
Right,
He said he
right.
was never told what to say. He was never scripted.
I have been on panels where, I'm sorry to say, some of my colleagues would argue that artistic performances should have a political message. I am completely against that. That's like hitting people over the head with a brick. It really, the artistic expression.
Artists can't really do that anyway.
Yes.
You know?
Exactly.
But we can, you know, by what we're doing, I feel that we're exemplifying the best American qualities of freedom of speech, of individuality, and that, you know, when you think about it, modern dance, Martha Graham, we were celebrating the individual voice, that somebody could come from nothing, and trust me, I did, because when I came into dance, I had no dance background. I had music, and I went to India as an exchange student. All these kind of mixed things came together, and yet nobody stopped me. You know, in some countries, if you don't have the right pedigree, you just can't do it. I mean, even in England, if you know, doctors will examine the legs of young girls, and if they don't, you know, seem like they're going to develop in the right way, they're just not given the opportunity to study ballet. But we have, you know, anything goes here, and here we are in the city of New York with literally hundreds of dance companies and theater groups, and, you know, everybody has the ability to do what they want. It's not to say that it's going to be easy. You know, nobody ever said it would be, but we can do it, and in many countries you can't. So when we go out and we do it, and we say to young people in Japan, you're going to make a piece of choreography. We are not going to teach you something from New York. And the grown-ups say, well, our Japanese students are not creative. But then we see them be creative, and we give them the license to be creative. We're bringing something very positive into that sphere, I feel.
Yes, yes. I mean, that's.
And Helena is our board chair, and she has been our board chair ever since she
full
came
disclosure,
to New York.
I am the
And
board chair.
Judy
of
Killichan
that.
has been our vice chair, and so we have two women who completely embrace the idea of cultural diplomacy, and that's why we have been able to do this. So thank you.
Thank you, and thank you, Jonathan. I know we have to get out of the room at 8 o'clock.
So, I want to thank you all for coming, and thank you for
And Victoria, I want to
talk.
thank you for giving voice to my words. When my voice ran out, yes.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yes. We had, yeah.